A couple of years ago, we issued at ERRA a study which basically examined how regulators are setting their revenue determinants, or how the allowed revenues of regulated licensees are being set among ERRA member organizations. And that was a very, I think, important study. It certainly generated a lot of interest from not only the members, but of course it's a publicly available study. So I've seen it referenced in a number of other streams of work. And a continuation to that, recently, we have been working on a study to define the regulatory approaches on how now the regulators allocate those allowed revenues among tariff structures and tariff categories. So we are very glad to be in a position to finally present the study. As we said, it was already published and sent to all of our members. I think a lot of people are excited about the study because it's truly one of a kind in this sphere. And I think it goes into an area of regulation that is perhaps not as well harmonized as the first paper. And to provide us with this presentation is a dear colleague from Economic Consulting Associates in Athens, Grigorios Varympopiotis. Greg, welcome to ERRA. Good to see you again. And the floor is yours. We are all ears. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning from my side as well. Before I start with the presentation, I would like to thank everybody who participated in this study, but providing information regarding their tariff designs. So as Ardian mentioned, this is a study on regulatory approaches of electricity transmission system operators and distribution system operators for the network tariff structures. And this is based on information provided by ERRA member organizations. So what are we going to look today? We'll have a brief introduction to understand the concept of the study, the regulations and the principles for the design of network use of system charges and connection charges, how regulators or TSOs and DSOs group customers for charging, what type of charges they apply, what are the pricing signals and locational signals embedded in the tariff design for network use of system charges. We'll also look at the relative charging levels among tariff categories, the depth of connection charges and other elements for the design of connection charges, and if special tariffs are designed for emerging technologies, for example, electric vehicles or other emerging technologies such as smart devices. So this presentation summarizes the findings for the tariff design of network use of system charges and connection charges among ERRA member organizations. The scope was to collect information from ERRA's MOs, member organization, in relation to electricity network tariff designs to deliver a study for benchmarking or knowledge sharing of transmission and distribution use of system charges and connection charges tariff designs. A second objective was to deliver an insight for other institutions for further analysis on tariff design elements. The study draws on survey data collected from 26 member organizations of ERRA out of 32 surveyed. So there was a very good response rate on the questionnaires we submitted from ERRA member organizations, and covers network use of system charges and connection charges for tariff design. And the concepts we looked to unravel included regulations and principles, drivers for grouping customers, locational signals, the treatment of generation versus load in the charging design, treatment of losses, type of charges that are being used, energy, capacity, fixed charges, time of use charges, the depth of the connection charge, the payment method applied for connection charges, sharing the factors for connection charges, and as I mentioned earlier, also use of special tariff designs for emerging technologies. We also analyze the present level of charges that are being applied and the relative difference for the charging of different customer categories. All the figures and the information you will see in the following slides were sourced from the survey that was carried out through the member organizations of ERRA. So let's look at the results that came out of the study. So the typical approach is for regulators to develop and approve the tariff design. At the right-hand side here, we see two figures. The top figure analyzes the entity responsible for approving the tariffs. And the second figure at the bottom analyzes the entity responsible to develop the tariff designs themselves. The blue bar is the regulator, the orange bar is the government, and the gray bar is TSOs or DSOs. So when we're looking at the entity approving the tariffs, we see that the majority of member organizations have the regulator or the government approving the tariff. So almost in none of the countries, the TSO or the DSO can approve the tariffs. For the development of the tariffs, for use of system charges, 75% approximately of countries have the regulator to develop the tariff designs, and the remaining were the government. Whereas for connection charges, we have the regulator developing the charges in almost half of the countries. And in the remaining countries, we see that here the DSO or the TSO is also allowed to develop the tariff design, following the principles and the regulations that were developed by regulators. Some other statistical information regarding our sample. So in all of the countries that we examined, network charges were completely unbundled. There were only 4 exceptions: Dubai, Algeria, Thailand, and Czechia. And in the sample of 26 MOs analyzed, most MOs had only one TSO, 92% of the countries, while most countries had more than 3 DSOs. So approximately 50% of the countries had more than 3 DSOs. So let's look now at the principles, the key principles that are developed in order to guide the tariff design process for network charges. So cost recovery and cost reflectivity are the most common and important principles among MOs for tariff design. So again, here at the right-hand side, we see a figure with the principles that were applied by member organizations. And it shows the frequency for those principles in the regulations in each country. The orange bars are connection charging principles, and the blue bars are use of system charges. So we see at top, the most frequent principles are cost recovery and cost reflectivity. Transparency is also important, and then the remaining are avoiding cross subsidies, equity, security of supply, allocative efficiency, affordability, simplicity, but these are observed in a less frequent manner than the top approach, the top principles. So this leads us to the conclusion that there are some first order requirements which are very important. So cost recovery, which means that our tariffs should be able to recover the total costs, so the costs that are typically determined by the allowed revenues. And also tariffs should also be cost reflective, which means that they should reflect the cost of supply. The second order requirements are transparency, which means that tariffs should be calculated using published methodologies. Simplicity, tariffs should be easy to understand by consumers and generators, and they should also be affordable for consumers. Equity and fairness is another principle, which means all consumers should be treated equitably and in a non-discriminatory way. What we see with these principles and objective is that these inevitably come into conflict with each other. So, for example, trying to achieve cost recovery distorts cost reflectivity, and trying to achieve simplicity, so the simpler the tariffs are, then it also distorts cost reflectivity. So the tariff design becomes more of an art of how to balance these conflicting objectives, depending on the nature of the system, the circumstances, the economic conditions in the country, the signals that you want to pass, and in which areas you can do some compromises and improve the signals in other areas. So there is not one approach that fits all, but there has to be judgmental thinking when we are designing the tariffs to balance these conflicting objectives. So why cost reflectiveness is important in the tariff design? It is one of the guiding principles that comes on top in most regulations. So in theory, economically efficient or cost reflective pricing requires that tariff paid by customers should be equal to the marginal cost of that customer. And what is mentioned that if this is not the case, then the outcome is inefficient. In this figure here, we see at the vertical axis the costs or the tariff, and in the horizontal axis the quantity. The dotted curve that you see here is the marginal cost curve, and here it cuts the curve of costs and quantity at this point here. So if we charge tariffs that are lower than the marginal cost of supply, then this means that there will be losses to the utility. So customers are supplied at a price that is below the cost of supply. On the other hand, if we have tariffs that are higher than the marginal cost of supply, then consumers do not consume as much as they would if the tariff was at the marginal cost. So we lose some of energy that could be supplied to the economy, and thus we get unmet demand. So which approaches do MOs apply for determining cost reflective tariffs? Approximately 50% of MOs apply the embedded cost approach. Another very popular approach is the long-run marginal cost approach. Approximately 35% of MOs apply this one. And the remaining is mainly expert judgment, trying to balance conflicting objectives. The typical frequency among member organizations for the redesign of tariffs was 4 to 5 years. So we don't want to change the tariff design very often, because there is some time that is needed for consumers to react to the pricing signals we are passing through our tariffs. And at the same time, circumstances in the market, in the economy, in the nature of the network change. So we want to update the tariff design. So the typical average was 4 to 5 years. The key principles now to guide the categorization of customers were simplicity, cost reflectivity, subsidies, and ease of identification. It is necessary to group customers into customer categories when we don't have time of use pricing structures, and we have single rate tariffs to charge our customers. In these cases, we need to group customers together, and the key principles that were adopted was simplicity, which means to have as few categories as possible to reduce billing complexity. But if we have very few tariff categories, then we are distorting cost reflectivity. The other key principle was cost reflectivity. So the grouping of customers should be based on the cost of supply. Then another principle is if we want to provide subsidies, so we need to separate these categories that we will provide subsidies. And also ease of identification. It should be easy to assign customers to a category. Typically, the number of tariff categories that we saw in the sample for use of system charges, for transmission use of system charges, most countries had 3 on average. For distribution use of system charges, the average number was 7. And for connection charges, the average number of categories was 4. And the key approaches that were used by MOs to group customers, the most popular measure that was being used was the voltage level of supply for use of system charges. And for the connection charges, the capacity requirement and the distance from the grid and the voltage level of supply. Now let's look at the type of charges that are being applied. Tariff structures should reflect the drivers of costs, but in practice, tariffs will deviate from this ideal structure for many reasons. So capacity charges, and here they are defined the charges which are, for example, euros or a currency per kilowatt or per kVA for a specific period, should be used to recover generation and network capacity costs, so the fixed costs of the networks. And they are typically based on demand, kilowatts or kVAs, at time of system peak, because the system peak is the driver of new investment needs. So the networks are designed to cover the system peak. Seasonal and time of day energy charges, euros per kilowatt hour, should be used to recover the variable cost of electricity supply in each interval. Fixed or standing charges, so euros per customer per period, should be used to recover the cost of customers related to activities such as metering or billing. So costs that change with the number of customers and not with the volume of consumption or the capacity requirements. And reactive power charges or penalties should be used to provide incentives for customers to improve their power factor. But in practice, tariffs deviate from this ideal structure for many reasons, including issues of acceptability or simplicity or cost of metering relative to benefits achieved for more complex tariff structures. So for example, to be able to apply seasonal time of day tariffs, we need either electronic meters or smart meters. So we have to look at the benefits that we will gain from applying such meters, from installing such meters against the cost of having them. So this is a heavy table here, and I've tried to summarize here what tariff types and pricing signals MOs use for network use of system charges in practice. I'll try to simplify this table a bit. In the horizontal, let's say in rows, we have the countries that were surveyed. And then in the columns, we see what practices are adopted in terms of price signals. So if they have a seasonal time of day tariff, in terms of locational signals, do they have zonal pricing, long-run marginal cost pricing, or tariffs that provide locational signals? And also what is the signals they pass to generation or load by applying a generation tariff and not only a tariff on consumers and load. Then the next set of information is for charges for consumers. So if the tariff design includes a power charge, which means either a charge for maximum metered capacity or an access charge, which we define it as per contracted capacity. Then also if they include an energy charge, and if they include a reactive power element in the charging structure. So this first set is for transmission use of system charges. And the second set at the right is for distribution use of system charges. So I'll comment on the averages that we see in the bottom. So for seasonal time of day signals, 96% of countries do not use seasonal time of day transmission use of system charges. Only 4% included in their tariff design seasonal time of day tariffs. Regarding locational signals, we see that 16% of countries used locational signals and the remaining did not. So the most common approach is not to have a locational element in the use of system charge. But at the same time, most of these countries, we will see that later on, they apply a deep connection charge policy for the connection charges. So they pass the locational signal through the deep connection charge. Then regarding the split of load and generation, so 24% of countries also charge generators, whereas 76% of the countries, they do not. And the most typical split is approximately 90% for load and 10% for generators to recover the costs. In terms of types of charges, we see that approximately half of the countries use a charge which is relevant to demand and capacity. The most common approach is to use energy charges. So almost all countries have an energy component in their tariff design, 90%. What is the reason of that? Typically, it's because it's simpler to have an energy charge, both for consumers and for the utilities to manage from an administrative manner. And for the meters that are being installed, almost all support energy measurements. And for reactive power incentives, 40% include charges that provide an incentive for reactive power, whereas 60%, the majority, they do not have an incentive for reactive power improvement. When we turn to the distribution use of system charges, we see that here seasonal time of day tariffs are much more often than the transmission use of system charges. So 56% of distribution system operators apply seasonal time of day tariffs, and the majority of those apply them to bigger customers where they have electronic or smart meters to support charging structures. For domestic users, the most typical approach is to have single rate charges. For locational signals, here we see even less than the transmission system locational signals. Only 4% of the countries have a locational element in their charging structure. And in terms of generation against load split for the recovery of the costs, 60% charge generators as well. For the types of charges that are being applied, we see that here the demand charges in comparison to the use of system charge for transmission is much higher, so 76% of countries adopt a demand charge. Again, here, the majority of countries use energy charges in the tariff structure, 96%, almost all. And reactive power incentives, again, are more popular in distribution use of system charges. 60% of countries use them in comparison to 40% in the transmission use of system charging structures. Another element that is useful to comment, only one country had only demand charges in their charging structures. Now, what portion countries choose to recover through demand charges? of revenues and what portion through energy charges. The light blue area, blue bars are for the recovery of costs through energy charges, and the dark blue bars are for the recovery of revenues through demand charges. And we see that the primary means for collecting revenues are energy charges. Here we have 5 different typical types of customers: HV connected big industrial customers, MV connected industrial customers, LV connected industrial customers, commercial customers, and residential customers. And at the top, we see the average among countries. So on average, 72% of revenues are recovered through the energy charges and 28% through demand charges. And for industrial MV customers, 64% through energy charges and 36% through demand charges. And then as we go to lower voltage levels, the portion that is recovered through energy charges is higher in comparison to that is recovered through demand charges. For example, for residential, almost all revenues are recovered through the energy charge, 93%, and a small portion through demand charges. To do this calculation, we have used typical consumption profiles for each customer category and the tariffs that were submitted through the member organizations of ERRA. In terms of tariffs for emerging technologies, we see that most MOs have not yet developed special tariff designs. Only 5 MOs have developed special tariff designs for distributed generation and storage, and also for electric vehicles and charging, and for self-generators or prosumers. These MOs were Austria, Lithuania, Poland, Slovakia, and Turkey. And most of these approaches are combined with net metering. So net metering is required to apply these special tariff designs. For Austria and for distributed generation, there is an energy charge, a demand charge, a contracted capacity charge, and a reactive power charge. And for Slovakia, they only apply a charge which is based on the maximum contracted capacity. And for Turkey, a charge is applied which is based on an energy charge and reactive power penalty. Then for electric vehicles, we see Poland and Slovakia applying a charging structure that is based on an energy charge. And for Poland, they also have a maximum meter demand charge. I would expect here to see a time of use charging structure, but it was not present in the special tariff designs. And for self-generators, Lithuania applies a tariff structure where they have an energy charge, a maximum contracted capacity charge, and they also need a net metering arrangement to apply the special tariff. I'll move a bit faster because I see I have exhausted most of the time that I was allowed to speak. This slide talks about the relative tariffs that are applied among customer categories. And what we see on average is that residential network use of system tariffs are 11 times higher than high voltage industrial use of system tariffs. Commercial tariffs are approximately 10.8 times higher. LV connected small industrial customers have 5 times higher tariffs than HV industrial, and MV industrial 4 times higher. So we see these findings in the figures here. Of course, these will change from country to country, depending on the specific systems that are developed in each country. But on average, we see the relative charging structures to reflect the cost of supply among MOs. Typically, the cost to supply a residential customer is higher than that of a commercial customer and that of an industrial customer, and this is for many reasons. So one of the reasons is that high voltage customers have lesser network costs than LV customers because of lower losses, and because HV customers do not use the MV and the LV network. So if there weren't residential customers, for example, we wouldn't need the LV network. So those connected at the LV network should be paying for that. And also because typically smaller customers contribute more to the system peak where costs are concentrated. Let's have a look now at the tariff design of connection charges. For transmission connection, the most typical approach is to apply a deep connection charging policy. And for distribution customers, the most common approach is to apply a shallow connection charge policy. The shallow connection charge policy is simple and transparent. It doesn't provide any locational signals. It is effectively a cross subsidy from existing to new users. Costs are socialized through the use of system charge, so the cost to upgrade the network further deep are recovered typically through the use of system charge, and also create some questions regarding what about later connections using the same assets. A deep connection charge usually also charges for reinforcements deeper in the network. So it allocates the full cost imposed by the connection to the new user. It's more complex and controversial to calculate. And there is a question if it is fair because the first mover will pay all the costs for the connection. Here, the table, we see what the majority of the countries apply. For transmission, 52% apply a deep connection charge, 35% a mix of deep and shallow, and 13% a shallow charge. 62% of the countries do not allow for cost sharing among customers, and 38% allow for cost sharing. And when we turn to the distribution system, 43% of countries apply a shallow connection charge, 32% a mixed approach, and only 25% a deep approach for distribution connection charges. Cost sharing is allowed in 35% of connection charging policies, and in 65% it is not allowed. Here is the final slide of some other considerations for the connection charges. So who pays for the development of the connection line? The most typical approach is for consumers to pay for the connection cost. So 85% of member organizations have the consumers to pay for the connection cost. But in some regimes that seek to incentivize new connection, the payment is recovered through the use of system charges. Ownership of assets, who should own the asset? The most typical approach is for the TSO or TSO to own the asset, even if the customer pays for it. And this approach is mainly adopted to ensure the safety and the reliable operation and maintenance of the grid. Can the payment be amortized over time for the connection charge? Typically, in most countries, it's a one-off payment, so 85% of MOs do not allow for an amortization of the payment. Only 4 MOs allow payments over time, and typically up to 5 years. Is cost sharing allowed, and is there a limit in time where customers can be compensated for costs they initially paid to connect to the network? Cost sharing is necessary when one customer pays to connect to the network and the infrastructure developed is planned to cover the connection of other potential customers that may connect in the future. It encourages new connection, and it is fair to avoid the problem of the first rider, so for the first customer to pay the total infrastructure cost. And we saw that cost sharing is allowed in 35% of MOs with a time limit of approximately 10 years. Finally, should generators pay for connection costs or not? The key conclusion from the study was that when generators pay for connection costs, then the charge can pass locational signals regarding the development of new generation. So if generation connections costs are socialized through the use of system charge, then the locational signal gets lost. That's a summary of the findings in this presentation. We can have a discussion now with questions you may have, and you can see the full details in the report that was published by ERRA and its website with more information, more findings, and more statistical analysis of the most common and typical approaches which are adopted by member organizations of ERRA, and also outliers. So the information for outliers are there for special cases, what is being applied. Thank you very much for your attention and your time.